Masechet Yevamot, Daf Samech Vav. We begin the seventh perek, which is not related to Yibum, but we're going to be speaking about Kohanim and their marriages, in this case, an illegal marriage, which we've been speaking about for quite a while. And here, regarding the eating of Tirumah. So, one point of background. Who is allowed to eat Tirumah? A Kohen and his wife, his children, his slaves, and if the slaves themselves own slaves, they also, everyone in the household of a Kohen who's properly married is allowed to eat Tirumah. If someone is married to a Kohen and he dies, then can she continue eating Tirumah? It depends. If they don't have children, then that's it. She has no more connection to the Kohen's family. She goes back to her father's house and goes back to her original status. If, however, they do have children, then that child that's alive will continue the connection of the mother to the deceased Kohen, and she can continue eating Tirumah even though the Kohen husband has died. And that's a general background, and now we can jump right in. Almana lechohen gadol, gerusha v'chalutza lechohen hedyot. If you have an illegal marriage, a widow married to a kohen gadol, or a divorcee, or someone who received chalitza is married to a regular kohen. So this is a problem. They're supposed to get divorced. If they do stay married, the marriage is a valid marriage. So in all these cases, because she is rendered a halala and they are not allowed to be married, she cannot eat tirumah. If they're supposed to get divorced, and if they stay married, she cannot eat tirumah. Now, hichnisa lo avdei melog ve'avdei son barzel. But here's the interesting question. What if she brings property into the marriage? She brings slaves into the marriage. What about those slaves? They're part of the household. Can they eat tirumah? They didn't do anything wrong. They're not halalim. So in this case, it depends on what kind they are. And so we're going to see there's two different types of property that a wife brings into the marriage. Avdei melog lo yochelu bitruma. Avdei son barzel yochelu. So it depends. If it's avdei melog, the origin of the word melog, nobody's sure what it is. It may be from an Akkadian term. The point here, this is property, or in this case, slaves, that the wife owned and brings into the marriage, and she retains ownership. While they're married, because the husband has the obligation to provide for his wife and for everyone in the family, he can benefit from the fruit of the labor of the slave, or if it's land, the fruit of the land, or if it's stock, he'll get the dividends, and he has to feed these slaves during the marriage. But at the end of the marriage, she takes the original principal back, whether it increased in value or decreased. So she retains ownership. Because she retains ownership of these slaves, they cannot eat tirumah. She cannot eat tirumah. She's a halala. These are her slaves. They cannot eat tirumah either. But if it's the other type, avdei son barzel, that means property that, if it's nichseh son barzel, or in this case, avdei, servants, this type of property she brings in, and he takes full ownership of this property, of these slaves. At the end of the marriage, he or his inheritance will still have to pay her the original value. We assess the value at the time of the marriage, put it in the ketubah, and we say, these slaves, or this field worth $10,000, and he will pay her $10,000 at the end. Whether it increased in value or decreased in value, it doesn't matter. In that case, he just owes her that value, but the item itself, the land, or in this case, the slaves, he owns. And therefore, since he owns them, and he's a Kohen, and he's eating tirumah, so those servants can eat. Those are rendered his servants. Okay, that's the basic point. The Mishnah goes on and elaborates, explains these categories further. Velohen abde melog. What does it mean? Servants that are the melog category, the ones that she retains fundamental ownership. Imetu metula imotiru hotiru la. If those servants die, it's her loss. If they increase in value, they grow up and show great talent, and they're worth more, then she gets the increase of their value. Even though while they're married, the husband has to feed them, and the husband is the one that will benefit from whatever they produce during the marriage, because he's responsible for all financial things, and he himself is going to feed his wife and so on, and children. Nevertheless, even though he is feeding them, still fundamentally they belong to the wife, and therefore the wife is a halala, and her servants cannot eat teruma. That's melog. Velohen abde son barzel. Son barzel are called that because they are iron sheep. They're as strong as iron. In other words, they're guaranteed payment. No, won't go up, but won't go down either. And also, son just meaning property in general, although son usually will produce wool and milk. But in this case, she does not benefit from any of that. He gets all of it, but she does get a guaranteed initial value that comes into the marriage. That's why it's called son barzel. It's as guaranteed as iron. Im metu lo. If these slaves die, then it's his loss. She will get paid at the end of the marriage no matter what. Im otiru lo. And if they increase in value, he gets the profit. So since the husband is responsible for responsible for financially, where they go up and down, so he is the owner, and therefore they can eat teruma because they're no longer connected to the wife, but rather to the husband, and he eats teruma, so they eat teruma. Last section of the Mishnah, Bat Yisrael sheniset lechohen vichnisa lo abadim. If you have a case of a woman who is the daughter of Yisrael, so when she grew up, she could not eat teruma, and she married a kohen, and she brought with her slaves, servants, and this we're talking about a proper marriage, unlike the Resha, which was an illegal marriage. Now we're talking about a legal marriage. The Mishnah has this. This is typical of the Mishnah. It brings the exceptional case first, and then brings the regular case. But logically, we might have wanted to know the logic, the legal case first. So this is a normal marriage of Yisrael woman to a kohen, ben avde melog, ben avde son barzel. In that case, it doesn't matter. Both types of slaves can eat teruma. The reason is because the slaves that are son barzel, that belong to the husband, so they eat on account of being owned by the husband. And the slaves that are melog, that are owned by the wife, she is allowed to eat teruma. And we'll see the law in the Talmud. We'll see the proof for this, that someone who can eat teruma, they themselves are allowed to feed someone else teruma. They can merit that the next person that they own, so that she owns these slaves, they also can eat teruma. Ubat kohen sheniset li Israel vichnisa lo avadim. The opposite case, a woman was a daughter of a kohen, so growing up she was allowed to eat teruma, and she brings servants into the marriage. Ben abde melog, ben abde son barzel, hare elu lo yochelu betiruma. In that case, once she gets married to a Yisrael, she has to stop eating teruma. She takes on the label of her husband, and therefore the slaves also, both the slaves melog that she owns and the son barzel that he owns, it's the same thing. He can't eat teruma, his slaves can. She cannot eat teruma, and therefore she cannot entitle her slaves to eat teruma either. So those are the simple cases and good background for the complex case that we started with in the Mishnah. Now the Talmud asks, "Ve'abdei melog lo yechelu b'truma amai." Here's the question: the servants that she brings in, that she retains ownership of, they cannot eat teruma. Why not? Leve kinyano shekana kinyan. Why don't we say that those servants are the same as a servant that acquired a servant? So here's the analogy. Are we analogizing a wife to a servant? Yes, we are. For these legal purposes, it doesn't mean that the husband actually owns the body of the wife like a slave. But for this purpose, we are bringing an analogy. if a kohen owns a slave and that slave owns a slave, how could a slave own another slave? Think of in Downton Abbey, you know how the butler himself has servants who make his bed and serve him food, right? So yes, a slave can own a slave, and this is the law. If a kohen owns a slave, that slave can entitle his own slaves to eat terumah. So to here, why don't we say that although the wife is a halala, nevertheless she is owned by her husband in some form, and so therefore we can see her slaves, the avdei melog, as his own, the husband's, the kohen's wife herself owns slaves, so those slaves should be able to eat terumah, since their master's master can eat terumah, should be the same as the slave's slave of a master. That is the question. Okay, and we could just therefore kind of skip the wife. She cannot eat terumah, she's a halala, but so what? Let her servants eat it on the count of the husband. Detanya, and now we're going to prove that this law is in fact the case, that terumah status, entitlement to terumah, can go 2 levels of ownership. Here's the basic first level. How do you know that a kohen that married a woman or bought slaves, that the wife or the slaves can eat terumah? Shnemar ve'kohen ki yikneh nefesh kinyan kaspo hu yochal bo. If a priest buys any soul, including kinyan kiddushin or kinyan avadim, which are 2 different concepts, again I'll emphasize, but nevertheless have this same legal ramification in terms of in terms of terumah, he can eat it, meaning the slave, the servant can eat it, the wife can eat terumah. Good, that's one level. And how about a second level? If a wife buys slaves, or if the slave themselves buy slaves, there's some technicality. Anything a slave acquires goes to the owner. How can a slave buy a slave? Okay, you could have a condition. Here's money that you're going to acquire, and it's not going to be mine. The master tells the servant. Okay, so if the secondary slaves, how do you know that they sheyochelu b'terumah shnemar ve'kohen ki yikneh nefesh kinyan kaspo? These are extra words. Hu yochal bo kinyano shekana kinyan ochel. You could just get kohen ki yikneh nefesh hu yochal bo. What do you mean kinyan kaspo? So we're reading it as saying that if a kohen buys a person and that person himself buys a person, his kinyan kaspo, the servant's kinyan kaspo, can eat terumah. So that's the basis of the question. So since these slaves are owned by the wife, who is herself under the husband, so the avdei melog should be able to eat terumah as well. And we're going to see 3 answers to this. Number 1, kol ha'ochel ma'achil, kol she'en ochel eno ma'achil. We have a general principle. Only someone who themselves can eat can entitle those under her to eat. Anyone who cannot eat cannot entitle those under her or him to eat. And therefore, in this case, because the wife herself cannot eat terumah, she cannot entitle her slaves to eat terumah. That's a rule. It only goes through her. Okay, velo. Now we question this. This would answer the question. But is this actually a general rule? Does it apply in all cases? If you have a kohen who's not circumcised, let's say because he had 2 older brothers who died in circumcision, and so he doesn't have to, or if he is tameh, someone who's tameh, kohen who's tameh cannot eat terumah. First Mishnah in Masechet Berachot. And they cannot eat terumah, and yet their wife or children or slaves all can eat terumah, even though they cannot. So this is not a true rule. Here we have a case of en ochel. The kohen cannot eat while he's tameh, but he can entitle others to eat. The answer to that is no. These are like someone whose mouth hurts. If someone has a toothache and they're not eating terumah because it hurts to eat, so that's just a temporary problem, right? They'll go to the dentist, and in those days probably just have their tooth pulled, and then they'll be okay. Here also, if someone is an arel, it's a temporary problem. They can be circumcised, or not if it's dangerous. But it's not an intrinsic problem. Someone who's tameh, they'll go and become tahor, right? They'll go to the mikveh next day, whenever it's their time, and become tahor, and then they can eat terumah. So this is not a intrinsic pasul in the person, but rather just a temporary label, that problem that they have. And that's why in these cases, even though they cannot right now eat terumah, they can entitle others to eat terumah. This is completely different from this wife who is now a halala and will be a halala forever. Even after they get divorced or he dies, she will not be able to eat terumah again. And she won't be able to marry Kohen again. Okay, v'hareh mamzer. Oh, we have another case where this rule is challenged. In the case of a mamzer she'en ochel u'ma'achil. How could you have a mamzer who does not eat, but he does entitle someone else to eat? The case would be as follows. A woman who's married to a Kohen, and they're permitted, everything's fine, and he dies. Now, if she has a child or grandchild alive, then she can eat terumah. What if that grandchild is a mamzer? How could that happen? For example, they have a child. This woman and the Kohen have a child. That child marries a mamzer. The grandchild will be a mamzer. That grandchild mamzer, even though is a grandchild of the Kohen, cannot eat terumah. Mamzer cannot eat terumah. Nevertheless, his existence permits his grandmother, the original wife, to continue eating terumah as a widow of a Kohen, because she's still connected to him since they have offspring. And so here you go. A case of mamzer is someone who himself cannot eat terumah, but he can entitle someone else to eat terumah. And so now we are stuck. We don't have an answer yet. Ravina will save this line of reasoning. Amar Ravina, kinyan ochel ka'amar, kinyan ochel ma'achil. Sheno ochel, eno ma'achil. Ravina clarifies this rule that we had here that we used to answer the question. And he says, if someone who is owned, who themselves can eat terumah, that's what we're talking about. If this person who is owned, who is subservient, can't eat terumah, then they can also entitle someone else to eat terumah. And if the person who is owned cannot eat terumah, they cannot entitle someone else to eat terumah. This new formulation will exclude the case of mamzer, who is a generation afterwards that is entitling the grandmother to eat terumah. No, we're not talking about that case, but rather the normal cases that we've been seeing before, where you want a servant or a servant to eat terumah. In that case, it only works if all the way up the line everyone can eat terumah. And so therefore that would explain all the cases so far. It would explain why a Kohen's servant can eat terumah, and since the servant can eat terumah, their servants can eat terumah. However, a Kohen's wife, if she's a divorcee and they're not allowed to be married, she cannot eat terumah, and that's why her slaves, her avdei melog that she owns, cannot eat terumah, even though they are under a person who is under the Kohen, but the middle step, that wife cannot eat terumah, therefore she cannot entitle her slaves to eat terumah. Okay, good. Very good. Nice, straightforward reason. And that's fundamental on a deoraita level. The next two answers will be derabanan gezerot. Rava amar mideoraita mechalach. Rava concedes the basis of the question and says, you're right. In fact, nechse melog, that she brings in and she retains ownership, really midoraita should be able to eat terumah, because they are the property of the Kohen. They are the property of the wife who is a property of her husband. And so really, they should be able to eat teruma on the Doraita level. But the rabbis made a gezerah because this is confusing. Kedesh tomar ani ochelet abadai enan ochelin zonahi etzlo hilkach ate la'apuka. The rabbis wanted her to think to herself. This is amazing. Listen to this. She says, look, I'm married to a Kohen, and I cannot eat teruma. Not only can I eat teruma, that she can understand. She's a divorcee, and okay, but even my servants cannot eat teruma, my nichse avdei melog that I brought in. So what am I, a zonah? To him, it's like I'm not even his wife. They should get... A marriage to a Kohen is supposed to come with privileges that one can eat teruma. It's free food. People come and give it, and it's very chashuv, very respectable to eat teruma. And so not only me, even my servants can eat teruma. I feel like a zonah. What's going to happen if she feels like that? She's going to go to her husband and start complaining and start fighting with him, and that's good. We want that because then he will divorce her. And in this case, we want him to divorce her because they weren't allowed to get married in the first place. And every day they have to get divorced. And so we don't want her to get too comfortable. Oh, my slaves are eating teruma, right? I'm getting all these good things. I'm not going to get divorced. No, we want to cause them to fight. Okay, fantastic, amazing answer. Rava says. Rav Asher says something else. Amar also gezerah, but in this case he says gezerah because of a confusion with other similar cases. Shema ta'achir la'achar mitah. We may think, since while they are married and he's alive, if we allow her servants to eat teruma, even though she cannot eat teruma, then even after the husband dies, she will think, oh, look, my servants were allowed to eat teruma while he was alive, even though I wasn't. So even after he dies, it makes sense that they should be able to continue. But even though that's not true, because they're only allowed to eat because of him, not because of her. The Gemara now challenges Rav Asher's logic from a regular case. Ela me'ata bat Yisrael sheniset the Kohen, a bat Yisrael who's married to a Kohen, who's permitted to him, the sefa of our Mishnah. Maybe we should say the same reasoning. Lo ta'achil, while she's married to a Kohen, she should not entitle her slaves to eat teruma because then after he dies, she'll think, hey, well, since my slaves were allowed to eat while I was married to the Kohen, so therefore they're allowed to eat even after the Kohen died, even although there's no children. And that's incorrect. Once he dies, she goes back, but she'll be confused. But no one would make that gezerah, right? That would prohibit every case. And no one would make that mistake either, right? Every bat Yisrael, she knows, while she was growing up, she did not eat teruma, her servants did not eat teruma. When she got married, then she starts eating teruma, and her servants also eat teruma. When the husband dies and they have no children, then she goes back, and the servants also will go back to their original state of not eating teruma. So there's nothing confusing about that. And so here also, there's nothing confusing about such a case. And so there's no reason to make a gezerah for this halala, this person who divorcee, who was this divorcee who married the Kohen, and she cannot eat teruma the whole time. Her servants could not eat teruma before she got married. Now they can eat teruma, and then they'll go back to not eating teruma after he dies. So it's no more confusing than a normal case. So Rav Asher just fixes one point and reinstates his answer. Be'almana kohenet. No, we're talking about a bat kohen who is illegally married to someone. Like when I use an example of a widow married to a Kohen Gadol. But it seems that would be the same thing for a divorcee married to a Kohen. The point is that it's a bat Kohen. So she was always eating teruma, even when she grew up as a little girl. And her servants were always eating teruma even before she got married, that she brought in. And now she will rationalize to herself in the following way. When I was growing up, I was eating a teruma from my father's house. In Sible Lehai, now I got married to this guy. And now I cannot eat teruma anymore because this marriage is illegal. She is an almana, a widow married to a kohen gadol. She cannot marry. She cannot eat teruma, but she says, my servants, they are eating in teruma on account of my husband. Now that he died, I'm going back to my original circumstance. And in her original circumstance, she was allowed tiruma, and the servants were allowed to eat tiruma. So from her perspective, her servants were allowed to eat tiruma continuously from being single into marriage, and she'll figure, well, it'll go back into her being single, and her servants can continue eating tiruma. So because she's a bat kohen, it's more confusing. If a bat Yisrael, she knows the distinction already from her single days, but a bat kohen will not distinguish because her servants were always eating teruma. She will not realize that originally when she was single, she herself was not a halala, therefore she could eat teruma, and her servants were eating teruma on account of her. But now that she's married, she herself is a halala, and the servants are only eating teruma on account of the husband. But now that the husband is gone, they have to not eat teruma ever, which never happened to her before. And so that's why we make a gezerah for the case where she is a bat kohen. Okay, tenach almana kohenet, almana bat yisamaik alememar. Oh yeah, but that logic only works if she is a bat kohen. What if she is a bat Yisrael? Then it won't be a problem because she will know, she'll remember that she didn't eat and her servants did not eat teruma before. So we answer, amunuta la pelige rabanan. We have a lo pelug. The rabbis aren't going to make one law for a bat kohen, one law bat Yisrael. We make one law for everyone because one case will be confused with the other, and therefore that's the reason. So to summarize, we asked the question: how come these servants, the nichse melog, the ones that the wife retains ownership of, why can't they eat teruma even though their master, the wife, is a halala because she's illegally married? And so we saw three answers. Number one is that rule that someone who can eat can allow others to eat only applies when someone themselves can eat. So, or to say it better, the rule that a servant's servant can eat teruma of a kohen, that only applies if it goes all the way through, that everyone down the line can eat teruma. But if a kohen's servant cannot eat teruma, then that servant cannot entitle the second level servant, and here that would be the wife. Though since the wife cannot eat teruma, she cannot entitle others to eat teruma. That was the deoraita answer number one. And answer number two is because we want them to fight. We don't want her to get too comfortable. And so really, midoraita, the avde melog can eat teruma. We say no, so that she will feel like there's no point in, there's no benefit here. She'll feel like a zona, and she'll get into a fight, and they'll divorce, which is good. In this case, because they were illegally married. And the third answer is because it's confusing in the case where she is a bat kohen. She has to know that once he dies, she goes back to her father's house, and she is a halala, and therefore her servants cannot eat teruma anymore. And that will not be clear unless we prohibit them from eating teruma even while they're married. Okay, those are the three cases, three answers to our question. And the second half of the sugya goes into a new topic, which is, what is the status of nichse son barzel? Up until this point, we've been assuming that nichse son barzel belong to the husband, and that's why avdeh son barzel can eat teruma. They're directly under him, since if their price goes up or down, he's responsible for that financial gain or loss. And so although he has to pay the wife at the end of the marriage the original estimated price, but he owes her that money, but they belong to him. So that's what we've been assuming until now, and it's basically true that he will incur any loss or gain. However, it's not necessarily entirely true that it's totally his, and she has lost all rights to it. So this is going to be a subject of machloket. Itmar. Hamachneset shom leba'ala, a woman who brings in something, let's say she brings a piece of furniture into the marriage, and this is estimated that this couch is worth $1,000. And so they put in the ketuvah, he's going to have to pay her at the end of the marriage $1,000 for the couch, and even if it goes up in value or deteriorates and goes down in value, that'll be his problem. He omeret kelai ani notelet, and then they eventually they get divorced. And she says, "Listen, I don't want the $1,000. I want this couch." V'hu omer damim ani noten hadin imi, but he says, "No, I will pay you the $1,000. That's what we agreed to. That was the assessment at the time of the marriage, and so I'm paying you, and I am keeping the couch." All right, they both like this couch. So who has the rightful claim? Rav Yehuda Amad Hadin Imah. Rav Yehuda surprisingly says she is in the right. Rav Ameh Amad Hadin Imo. Rav Ameh says he gets to keep the couch and he pays as they had agreed. So we have to explain Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda Amad Hadin Imah Mishum Shevach Bet Aviha Dida Haveh. Rav Yehuda explains that this asset is from Bet Aviha, and this was something that she was very proud of. Her father's family was very proud of, and she brought it into the marriage, and so it has this sentimental value, and she can claim this continues to have importance for my father's house, and therefore I want to take it. And that's a valid claim. So she does have some connection to it. Rabbi Ameh Amar Hadin Imo, Kevan Damar Mor, Metu Lo, Imotiru Hotiru Lo, Hoil Bechaya Ba'achariutan, Yochelu. Rabbi Ameh proves his side from our very Mishnah and says he is right, since we said in the Mishnah that if it dies, if those Avdeh Son Barzel die, it's his loss, and if they become more expensive, then it's his gain. So since he is responsible for their financial status, therefore he is they can eat terumah. So you see, he is responsible for them. He gets the gain and the loss. That means he is the owner, and that's it. He owns them, and she has no claim. All right, so that makes it a bi'ameh. We understand his proof from the Mishnah. But Amad of Safra is going to challenge that reasoning. Mika atane vehen shelo. The Mishnah doesn't say that these slaves belong to him. It could have said a more simple language. Ho'il v'chaya b'achariotan. It just says he's responsible for them. That's like a custodian, someone watching something is also responsible as a watchman. It doesn't mean that person owns it. He's just holding on to it. That's why he incurs a loss and gets a gain, but doesn't mean he owns it. Katani olam lavdi dehu, and it's not actually his. And so Rav Safra is supporting Rav Yehuda that her claim is better. Now, the Gemara is going to challenge Rav Safra himself. Wait a second. If someone is only responsible for something, then can they entitle that person to eat? Right, to eat terumah, a person or animal, as we're going to see in a second, right? A non-ownership, but only responsibility, is that sufficient to entitle someone or some animal to eat terumah? Ve'hatenan, we have a Mishnah in Terumot that says, Yisrael shesachar para mi kohen, hareze ya'achilena karshine terumah. If a non-kohen rents a cow from a kohen to work his field, so he can feed it karshine vetch, that is terumah. A vetch is a certain vegetable. It looks like this. It is technically edible for humans, and that's why it is chayav in terumah. However, it's not really. Humans don't usually eat it. Animals usually eat it. Now, generally, terumah which is edible by humans, has to be eaten by humans. You have to treat it in a very respectful way. You can't just feed it to your animals. Use it in a disrespectful way. But this vegetable called vetch, which even though it is technically edible to human, but people don't usually eat it. Therefore, it's okay to even though it's chayav in terumah, and it is terumah, it's okay to feed it to animals. So in this case, a Jew rented from the kohen, he can feed it these karshinim because it belongs to the kohen. Kohen is the owner even though the Jew that rented it is responsible in case something happens to it, to the animal, and nevertheless it goes by the owner, not by the custodian who's responsible for it. The opposite case, Kohen shesachar para miYisrael. A Kohen rented it from Yisrael, alav, even though the Kohen is responsible for feeding it because he rents it, and when you rent the animal, you have to feed it as it's working. He cannot feed it tiruma because it goes by the owner and not by the one who is responsible. And therefore, this indicates that the requirement for entitling someone else to eat tiruma is possession and not responsibility, and that rejects it of Safra. All right, we question that itself. It is bera nehi name de mechaya begeneva va'abeda be'onaseha bechachashaha ubenifhat dameha mi michayav. Says, hold on. It's true that a renter is responsible in case the animal gets stolen or lost, and he has to replace it. But if it's some unavoidable accident, or if it somehow becomes thinner, emaciated while it's working, or it decreases in value because of its wear and tear, that he is not responsible for. So a renter is not actually fully responsible. Maybe that's why in these cases it goes by the owner and not the renter. That's a separate thing. But our Mishnah, which was about the slaves, where the husband is fully responsible for everything that happens to the slaves, all the ups and all the downs, that is closer to ownership. And that's why he would eat teruma in that case. Our Mishnah is actually similar to the Sefa of the Mishnah regarding the animals, where it says, Yisrael shesham para mikohen, a non-kohen who appraises a cow and says, okay, what's this cow worth? $500. All right, I'm going to use it, and I guarantee its value. Oh, see, this is more like an arrangement of son barzel in a marriage from a kohen. Then that non-kohen cannot feed it teruma because he is accepting full responsibility, even though not full ownership. Aval kohen shesham param Yisrael yachilena kashine teruma. A kohen who does this assessment and guarantees a value of an animal and then uses it can feed it teruma, even though he's not the full owner, because he is in fact fully responsible. And so we see from this that it is in fact responsibility that entitles an owner to feed his animals or his servants teruma. With this argument, we have rejected the proof of Rabbi Ameh from our Mishnah. Rabbi Ameh tried to prove that because the Kohen husband can entitle the Avdeh, son barzel, to eat teruma, that means he owns them. And since he owns them, he can keep the couch too, because he owns it fully. And we reject this and said, no, he doesn't necessarily own it fully. It just means he's responsible. He's fully responsible for it, and full responsibility is sufficient to allow an animal that one fully owns to eat teruma, or a slave that one is fully responsible for to eat teruma. But full responsibility is enough for teruma, but is not full responsibility, is not full ownership. And therefore, these nichsei son are not necessarily actually fully owned by the husband, and so therefore, it could be that the wife can claim that I want to take the couch. All right, so we have no proof from the Mishnah, and now we're going to try to find a proof this way and that way. Yetev Rabba v'Rav Yosef v'Shilhei Pirkei de Rav Nachman. After Nachman gave his great long derasha, the Pirkah, that was given to in public, and the students also came. At the end, his students, Rabban Rav Yosef, were sitting. And they said, you know what, we can find a braita that supports Rav Yehuda, and another braita that supports Rabbi Ameh. Let's see what they are. Tanya kevater Rabbi Ameh. We have a braita that supports Rabbi Ameh, that in fact it is the husband who fully owns the property, the nichsei son barzel, and he can take the couch home, because look at this braita: Avdeh son barzel yotzin b'shen va'ayin leish avalo leisha. Those slaves that come into the marriage as son barzel, they're assessed, and then the husband is responsible for them. If the husband should knock out the tooth or the eye of that slave, the slave goes free. Whereas if the wife causes such a loss, the slave does not go free. And the reason is because this law that an Eved Kana'ani goes free when there's a damage like this is only true if the owner causes the damage. So you see, the owner is the husband and not the wife. He is the full owner. He gets to keep the couch. Tanya kevate de Rav Yehuda hamachneset shom leba'ala im rasa habal limkor lo yimkor velod ela afilu hichnis la shom mishelo im rasa habal limkor lo yimkor. A Braita supports Rav Yehuda that she still retains some right, some ownership. Comes from here. Someone who brings in an assessed item to the marriage, the wife brings it in to the husband. If he wants to sell it, he may not sell it because she brought it in and it belongs to her. And not only that, even if he brought something into the marriage and had it assessed and included in the ketuvah, like he gave her a ring that he bought and he brought in, but he put it into ketuvah and said, here's how much it's worth, and therefore you get to take that amount at the end of the marriage. Again, there also, even though the husband actually bought it and brought it into the marriage, no, he gave it to her and had it assessed, so he cannot sell it. So you see that in both of these cases, she retains ownership. If they both decided that, you know what, we have to sell this because we need the money, they have to sell some item that was brought in as an assessed item in the ketuvah. This actually happened, and the case came before Rashbag, and he said that the husband can repossess it from those who bought it, because really this was guaranteed to her at the end of the marriage that she would be able to get a payment or even get the actual item. And so this is a proof for Rav Yehuda that she maintains a right to recollect that original item, and so she is has somewhat in possession, even in a case of son barzel. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Okay, so we had baraitot on both ways. What is the halacha? Halacha kedav Yehuda, that she retains the right. Amar le Rava Rav Nachman. V'hatanya kevated Rabbi Ameh. Wait, how could you say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? We have a baraita like Rabbi Ameh. Afagav de Tanya kevated Rabbi Ameh. Mistaberat Amad Rav Yehuda mishum shevach betabiyas. It's true, he has a baraita, but the logic of Rav Yehuda makes sense because of the family's prestige, her father's house. They had this couch, and it means a lot to them, sentimental value. So, yeah, she has a right, she has a claim, and she can ask for the couch. She gets the couch. Now, a really interesting case. Some woman, she brought into her marriage a robe. A very nice, fine robe that she brought in, and it was estimated $1,000. This robe costs. So shecheb, the husband died. Shekalu hayatme ufrasuha amitna, and now the children, the orphans, they decided to use this robe, her robe that she brought into the marriage. Her father, her father's house put it on the swanny, and they take it and use it as a burial shroud. By the way, even today, nowadays, we use very, very basic burial shroud, cheapest material, so that everybody's equal. But in those days, they used things that were very expensive. We saw back in Masechet Moed Katan that people were using very expensive burial shrouds to the point that some people couldn't afford it. And worse than the death of their relative was the fact that they had to pay so much money for an expensive burial shroud, and they'd leave their dead unburied until Rabban Gamaliel made a takana. It says everyone has to use just simple linen garments, and that's why we do that until today. Okay, but this would be back then when they took this fancy robe and they used it as a burial shroud. And she comes and says, wait, that's my robe. I brought it into the marriage and I want that robe. I don't want the money. I want that robe to take with me. The marriage ended. He died. Rava said, sorry, the dead guy acquired it. I mean, he's not alive, but just by being buried with it, it becomes consecrated and can be used only for the benefit of the dead, and she cannot have it. not available. Amar le nanai bered Rav Yosef bered Rava Rav Kana Amar Rava Amar Rav Nachman halacha ke Rav Yehuda. Wait a second, Rava is the one up here said halacha is like Rav Yehuda, that she has a claim and she can take the couch with her, so she should be able to take this robe with her. Amar le mi lo modeh Rav Yehuda de mechusar gu bayina kevan de mechusar gu bayina birshute ka'es. Yes, it's true. If it was still hanging in the closet, she could come and she could take it. But it was not yet taken. It was not. She did not yet move it from the closet and bring it and take possession of it and bring it back to her father's house. It was not yet collected. And since it was not yet collected, it's still in his possession. And so the orphans who inherited his property, they already came and made use of it, and now you can't get it back. So yes, halacha is like Rav Yehuda, but you have to go and get it before they go and make a different use out of it. Rava L'Tameh, and Rava who said this, that something that is not yet collected is not, if something is not in your possession, if it's not yet collected, then it's not yours. He said that as a general rule. Amar Rava, Hekdesh, Hametz, V'Shichrur, Mafki'in, Mideh, Shi'abud. We saw this once before. Rava says that something that you made Hekdesh, let's say you have an item that you set aside and you made it a guarantee for a loan, a lien. There's a lien against this, and you said, listen, if I don't pay you back, you can take this clock here. And so the person who lent the money has a lien on that clock. If the guy who borrowed the money makes it hekdesh, or if it was made out of chametz, right? You have a lien on this bread, and now Pesach comes, and now bread is prohibited, and he destroys it because it has to be destroyed. Or he made a slave as the lien, and then he freed the slave. And so now there's no more slave. So the one who lent the money now no longer has a lien, mafkin mideh shibud. So the lien goes away. That's it. He can't go back and say, no, that's my slave, right? And bring him back and make him a slave again. I have a lien on that person and on that chametz. We say, sorry. It's true. If the loan came due and you came to collect it, you have a lien and you could have taken it, but before you take possession of it, you don't actually own it. And therefore, that Rava says that general rule, and that applies in this case also. Although we follow halacha like Rav Yehuda, and the wife does have a claim on the actual couch, nevertheless, the robe, and nevertheless, before she takes possession of it, possession is 90% of the law, and so she has a claim to it, but she has to actually take possession in order to be able to fully take it home. And in this case, they used it for a burial shroud first, and so she can no longer collect it. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'Amen.